Joining me now is a member of the House Judiciary Committee who was a part of that hearing on Thursday, Congressman Ted Lieu. Congressman, it's always an honor to have you on our show. I was particularly interested to have you on, seeing how you were present at that hearing. What did you take away from Thursday's hearing, and where do you hope the inquiry will move on from here?
Thank you, Katie, for your question. Reverend Shank's testimony under oath was remarkable. He basically laid out corruption in the highest court of the land, and it showed that religious organizations and stealth missionaries were having this entire operation to influence individual Supreme Court justices outside of the public's view, getting them fancy dinners and getting close to these justices. And you end up having justices making decisions based on their view of religion instead of their view of the Constitution.
Your Republican colleagues very openly and very publicly, as well as their own witness, spent a large bulk of their time saying that Reverend Shank was untrustworthy. Congressman, I know you were also a prosecutor like I was. Part of what we do is judge credibility based upon body language and, frankly, the fact that somebody is also under oath. What was your opinion about Reverend Shank's trustworthiness upon testifying before Congress?
Reverend Shank was trustworthy because you just have to look at what he did. He voluntarily showed up at a congressional hearing under oath, under penalty of perjury. You wouldn't do that unless you're going to tell the truth. And Reverend Shank told the truth. And what we saw are these stealth missionaries being funded at very high levels to go and target individual Supreme Court justices, again, outside of the public's view, and having very intimate moments with these Supreme Court justices and influencing them to view religion in a certain way so that they would eventually overturn Roe versus Wade.
Putting aside whether or not the question of a leak, or maybe even two, of Supreme Court opinions on critical cases has a credibility problem, doesn't the sheer fact that the stealth missionaries, as they were called by Reverend Shank, had the kind of access that was purchased access to Supreme Court justice, doesn't that enough justify whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, the fact that there should be some ethical guardrails in place for even sitting Supreme Court justices?
Absolutely. And I was heartened to hear that at least some members of the Republican Party were willing to impose a code of ethics under the United States Supreme Court. Right now, federal district court judges have a code of ethics. Appellate court judges have a code of ethics. We also have an Office of Congressional Ethics. The White House has to follow ethical rules. The only people in government that don't have to follow any ethical rules are the 9 Supreme Court justices, and that is wrong. Who do they think they are?
On Thursday, the House passed the National Defense Authorization Act, a new military spending bill that includes aid for Ukraine and Taiwan. You were part of the overwhelming majority that voted in favor of that bill. Tacked onto that bill, though, is an amendment that adds new protections to the families of Supreme Court justices, which could have the consequence of shielding the public from knowing where they work, for example. But, you know, Congressman, considering what we learned about what Ginny Thomas was up to in terms of her activist jobs in the aftermath of the 2020 election, do you have a concern that this amendment may add another layer of secrecy that insulates the Supreme Court from public scrutiny?
I support protecting family members of justices as well as elected officials. We saw, for example, that the spouse of the Speaker of the House got his head hit by a hammer, was assaulted and attacked. So I will support protecting the family members of judges and justices as well as elected officials. So I think that's actually a good thing.
I wanted to ask you about a particular moment in the hearing. It has some legs on social media right now. At the end of his line of questioning with the Reverend, Ranking Member Jim Jordan said, "People who mislead folks on small things mislead them on big things." A few minutes later, your colleague, Representative Eric Swalwell, asked Congressman Jordan a question. Let's take a quick listen to it.
Well, Mr. Jordan's announced Donald Trump's termination of the Constitution.
President Trump has clarified his comments regarding the Constitution. He put out another post, I think, a day or so later, maybe the next day, I can't recall. And everyone knows President Trump There's no way this guy's anti-Semitic. This guy was the most pro-Israel president in history. So,
and do you denounce your tweet praising Kanye West?
That tweet was not our account, and that tweet's been removed.
You know, Congressman, as they say, we have the receipts. That was their tweet. It stayed up until, frankly, it was up too long. I mean, what is your reaction to Jim Jordan there, who is likely to be the next chair of this Judiciary Committee?
Representative Jordan thinks we all can't read, but actually we can read. And we read that Donald Trump posted that he wanted to terminate the United States Constitution. It was right there in writing. But I do want to go to the point about lying about little things. You know, 2 Supreme Court justices lied about very big things. Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh signed on to the majority opinion in Dobbs that said that Roe v. Wade was egregiously wrong from the start. There's no way they could have done that without knowing that that's what they believed at the time of the confirmation hearings, and they lied to the American people. They didn't tell U.S. senators, American people, that they believe Roe v. Wade was egregiously wrong from the start. In fact, they went out of their way to say the opposite, that Roe v. Wade was settled precedent.
Do you think, Congressman, then that there should be a new approach, some type of a way that during the confirmation hearing process for candidates such as nominees for the Supreme Court of the United States, that there's a way to be able to check that type of, as you're calling, lies, misrepresentations, if people want to be a little bit more generous about what they would do should they actually make it to the highest court in the land?
We do rely on the United States Senate to do this. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court justices lied to U.S. senators. Both Senator Collins and Senator Manchin issued public statements that basically said Gorsuch and Kavanaugh lied to them. And that's one reason the U.S. Supreme Court has its lowest approval rating in U.S. history. You can't have a functioning U.S. Supreme Court when multiple justices lied to the American people.
Before I have to let you go quickly, Congressman, I do want to ask you about some big news on Capitol Hill today. That is obviously Senator Kyrsten Sinema announcing she'd be leaving the Democratic Party to become an independent. What was your immediate reaction to hearing that news?
So functionally, it doesn't really affect how the U.S. Senate is going to operate. Right now, Bernie Sanders and August King are not members of the Democratic Party, but they caucus with Democrats, and Senator Sinema is going to caucus with Democrats. So Democrats are still going to have the majority, 51 to 49. This is basically something she's doing in terms of how she perceives her own reelection chances, and that's something she has a right to do.
Congressman Ted Lieu, as always, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. I appreciate you taking the time to join us and sharing your insight. Thank you again.
Thank you.